Hi, Sam. I'm excited to chat with you about essentially being a virtual architect because this is a topic that's been near and dear to my heart for many years, and I've always been on the lookout for anyone that is not only designing virtual spaces, but then has the opportunity to also see those spaces used in an interactive, functional way that starts to mirror or otherwise. Play off of the expectations of the real world versions of those spaces. So, of course, for anyone who doesn't know, you designed the Museum of Other Realities, which is an absolutely excellent virtual space with a lot of incredible work by different artists. And the work in the space, of course, allows for its own kinds of interactivity. You change scale for some of them. There's some that are playing with, you walk into it and your avatar changes, or you're flying in some areas. So my first question is really just, how did you get involved with the project?
It's a long story, but actually I was in New York working for Inside VR, which is AEC VR company focused on mobile VR specifically, so a lot of optimization. And at that time I just graduated. Basically, I just graduated from university in architectural design and went to New York for this new exciting startup job. And you may guess that to work at an AEC firm in VR, you need to be a VR nerd and obsessed with VR and architecture. So that is the case. Now, actually, when I was in university, I shared that workflow I had created. There wasn't even hand controllers back then, so I was using the Elite Motion to do design in VR. And as soon as I got, controllers through the Vive, as soon as those were available, well, I'm an artist first off, so, I've been doing art for about 10 years before that, in galleries and off of galleries. And so as soon as there were controllers, I was like, okay, I would stay after work and I'd do VR sculpture basically. There was basically only tilt brush, I think, at the time. This was maybe 6 months or a year before Medium came out and the Oculus controllers came out. So I'd stay after work and I would do tilt brush and then go home in my tiny little New York apartment and really was into this idea of I think really when you're talking about AEC and VR, there's kind of three, or XR I should say, there's kind of three steps. The first one is visualization. Analysis, you walk through, there's 5, 10, 15, 20 different apps that all do this. You can go visit your building in VR. The second one is design, which is something that the industry hasn't really picked up on. For some reason, Autodesk does not allow you to do design in VR. They've abandoned the idea. They say, it's hard to make a straight line in VR. It's like, well, you don't draw either. You're not an architect. I'm not asking you. I'm asking artists. I'm asking architects to design in VR. So there is a need there that's been ignored basically by the industry or dismissed by the industry. And actually, I just finished today. I just finished a submission to do a presentation at Autodesk University to present my workflow for designing in VR with Revit specifically, as I did in the Museum of Other Realities. So I'm I want to show you a little bit about the Museum of Other Realities and then this really weird workflow. But really, I want to show you this really weird workflow so that you can make it easy and make a plug-in between, Medium and Revit, because this is very painful and annoying, and nobody in their right mind should do this unless, they're kind of obsessed on the topic. So I kind of got lost in my thoughts there. So yeah, basically I've been doing VR and architecture and art since I've been able to, the Vive and tilt brush. And then as soon as the Oculus controllers came out, because, if you weren't there in the early days, the controllers came out 6 months to a year after the headset came out. And the DK2, you just had a camera, you could look at it, you couldn't touch it. You were it's kind of like the ice cream shop. You see all the ice cream and you can't have any of it. So finally you could put your hands in there, start, spitting your soul out into space. And so as soon as that was possible, I started doing that. And here we go. So when I was in New York, also I joined the hackathon. I think it was a week or two after I arrived in New York. I was in a hackathon. So we were doing this, what was it? It was, I just emailed them, Art-A-Hack.
Okay.
Yes. So they're actually doing something with live dance remotely right now, but very good hackathon, beautiful office space. And I don't remember the name of the company. There's multiple companies that handle it, but very nice people. And so I was like, I want to make tools so that people can make art shows in VR and eventually in AR, etc. So, we made a website mock-up, a little bit like Sketchfab, you can imagine. So you put up your art, and then you have another interface where you place your art, and it was all connected to AltSpace VR, which at some point we thought was going to die, and then got bought over by Microsoft. There was all this drama, and now actually they've just released, or I'm not sure if it's official yet, but they've just released a whole new bunch of avatars. So I was like, okay. Yeah, the little robots were getting a little... So, I mean, AltSpace VR is great because it connects to, pretty much all the platforms, specifically mobile as well. If you don't have a VR headset, you can still go on it. So, so yeah, I was like, let's make a tool so that you can have art shows in VR, and eventually we'll evolve it so that you can have art shows in AR. And all of this kind of comes from me being a VR artist and going to galleries and then being like, I don't know, what do you mean VR? I don't know anything about this. So it's like, okay, well, you don't want all the artists to have to deal with that. I just, hopefully, I wish I came in and this was a thing so I could just focus on doing art and not having to think, how am I going to sell it? How am I going to show it, et cetera, et cetera. So, wait, what was the original question? It was like, how did I get it to...
How did you get involved with design?
Right. Okay, yes, back on track. So, as part of this thing, which I was calling Culture Space or Cultural at the time, I was like, okay, I want to make VR art spaces on AltSpace VR. So, I'm going to design this platform, and I'm still doing. I was basically started to focus on these spaces that don't exist. This idea of having a VR art gallery. Well, it shouldn't look like it shouldn't look like a warehouse. It shouldn't look like a Greek Roman temple or like a gallery 100 years ago or 50 years ago. It should look like the medium. It should look like the future. It's like, when the internet came out, websites were super ugly. We had no idea what we were doing. It's actually quite hilarious when you go on the Bank of Canada's website from when the internet started. So we didn't know what the language of the internet was going to be. And obviously the language of the internet is very influential and quite different from books and magazines. So the same thing should be true of VR spaces in terms of architecture, in terms of the whole language. It's a whole thing we don't know about. And so discovering that language is kind of what keeps me going. It's kind of what... it's what keeps me going. I didn't say passionate, but that's a French translation. It doesn't make any sense. Ça me passionne. So yeah, I was creating a lot of these kind of speculative spaces. And one thing I've learned very early on in architecture in VR is that theorizing is not useless, but it's definitely not as useful as just doing it, going into the space and seeing if it works. For VR, for AR, stop thinking about it, stop writing about it, just do it, feel it, and that's one of the main advantages, right? Like in architecture, we'll talk about a theater for 10 years, we'll build it, and you know what, it doesn't work. Whereas in VR, it's like, well, you can just kind of press play in Unity and you're in it, and it works or it doesn't work, and that's part of the beauty of it, the kind of iterativeness of it. So yeah, I basically had these two parallel projects. Make a platform for VR art, and then as a VR artist, and I didn't know, I did know that I wanted to, I guess, be a VR architect because, I did do my master's. That would have been 4 years of school in Canada, and let's say I had like 30K of debt, right? So that would have been another 30K of debt. So I was like, and a lot of it is super theoretical and doesn't really lead you to a job. You kind of have to unlearn it all after anyhow. So I was like, okay, well, I'm not actually going to be an architect. I'm going to be this weird specialist in VR, AR, and architecture, wherever, as much as possible, wherever that leads me. And I'm also like a super specialist in Revit and everything BIM. So I know I always have like a safe bet with, like, I can get a job with BIM anywhere. Everybody needs a BIM guy. But VR and AR obviously is more interesting jobs, better jobs. But the thing is, there's maybe like 5 or 10 places where you can get a job in VR, AR architecture because it's so pointy and specific. So it's a great job, but there's not many employers. Or like, you know, if I wasn't so old and like in debt, I would have probably tried to start my own company, you know, if I had come from a more comfortable background, etc. So, yeah, so I was basically doing the platform and at the same time doing multiple galleries and in VR and also sculpting in VR and putting the art in the galleries so that, you know, I've got my professional track and then I've got my art track and they both keep going in parallels and they intercross more and more. The more they intercross, the happier I am, basically. So yeah, I was developing these spaces, and I was like, okay, let's have a VR art show. So I started reaching out to these VR artists that were, you know, on Twitter, around, etc. And I came across one artist, and I invited her to be in this show, and she's like, you know what? I don't think I'm going to be in this show, but you should, because I'm going to be in this other place, the Museum of Other Realities, but you should talk to these guys. So that's how I met Robin and Colin from the Museum of Other Realities. And so I invited them over. I had no idea what their backgrounds were. I was like, oh, well, she told me you should come see my space. So here it is in Altspace VR in Cultural. And at the time, you couldn't just upload your own worlds. You had to be a programmer. So actually, I should mention that, you know, there was a hackathon, and then I got some contacts at Altspace VR. We got like a $5,000 grant to do this, to make to allow users to have a website, upload their stuff on the website, and then bring it into Altspace VR. Never really went anywhere. Like a bunch of the money went to the developer, and then he just kind of like didn't finish it. So there was a time like it would work, and then it would stop working, and then it would work again, and then at some point it just stopped working because he just stopped answering, basically. Yeah. So, you know, but at least so anyways, we were on Altspace VR. I showed them the space, and they're like, this is great. You should see what we're working on. And so they brought me to these kind of secret shows at the Museum of Other Realities. And that actually, at the time, it was called THER, like THE-R or something. And it was amazing because every month or 2 or 3, there was a show where it was only industry people. So it was probably 60% VR artists with some like CEOs of VR companies and some people that work, you know, at Google. Oop, what the heck? Are you still there? Okay. Sorry, my screen went blank. So it was kind of like a meeting of the minds in this VR world where it's not public, it's just like invite only. So it's extremely mentally stimulating, you know, and pretty much every one of those shows, they would unveil a new room with some new art. And, you know, you'd come in 1 month and the gallery was completely different. And, yeah, so they were always inspired by, you know, I actually started showing art in there, some of my VR art, and always in a conversation with them. At the same time, I started building another gallery. And I mean, I build a lot of these spaces, and I don't really publish my work very much. It'll be like a picture on Twitter, and I retweet a bunch of other people's stuff. So if they come on my Twitter, it's not like it's just my stuff. And I just, I'm more into producing than documenting my own work. Like if I started documenting, I'd have to go back 10, 15 years. And I don't even have a website. So anyways, I was, but I'll show them what I'm working on, and I'll share those models with them. So at some point, I kept pushing that idea, like what kind of architecture, you know, could only exist in VR. Still referencing reality, but messing around with it and trying to play with those rules, trying to be kind of spatially cheeky maybe, and like also I have a background in lighting design and theater, much as you have. So like when I worked in lighting design, actually my boss had a background in theater, so we did lighting design, but there was always that kind of theatrical aspect. And then, obviously going to university opens up all of these really fun philosophical questions you can play with, and context, historical context, architectural history, art history. And so, yeah, just basically trying to discover what can be done that hasn't been done that we can do. Like, it's always fun for me to figure out, like, what can I do now that just wasn't even possible a year ago, that like is the language of what's possible now, and etc. So yeah, I kept having those conversations and sharing with them, Robin and Colin, here's the gallery. And one of my big projects is I have a gallery with that's not really shared. I have a gallery with maybe 12 rooms. That's kind of like I don't know. It's just something really long term for me. So what I do is I have this master plan of like these 12 rooms, and a lot of it is kind of an evolution of Louis Kahn. So it's all about really good indirect lighting, solar lighting specifically. And there's kind of like an epicness in solar lighting, and also it can look good from many different time of the day, and it changes, etc. It's not just like good electrical lighting looks good, but it doesn't change. It's not as alive. There's a different language there. So really trying to evolve what Louis Kahn was playing with, and obviously I can go further because I don't have like the limitations of concrete and budgets. And so I'm trying to create my own gallery that I don't really have any plan on showing anytime soon. And what I've been doing really is like I'll put a sculpture in there that I take like 3 to 6 months to make, like really, really, really detailed sculpture. And then I'll do a really crazy light baking in Octane, and I'll bring that into Unity. And so, what you get is something that's very realistic. So you don't see pixels, the shading is excellent. The art is extremely intricate, and there's a lot of detail. So that's kind of like my shtick, if you will, for my own art. It's what I love. It's architecture. This is some really old art, for example. But like you can see my real painting, it's very intricate, and this is not even finished. This is probably like 12 years old or something. But a lot of detail, a lot of intricacies. So it's really the VR art is an evolution of my painting art into 3D. And it's like if you're painting, a lot of the effort is like, oh, how do I recreate the light effect? Whereas if you're sculpting, you're like, okay, well, I know what shapes will give a good light, so I don't have to spend 60% of my brain power on good lighting. And then you're in the art. You're no longer looking at it through a frame, through a hole in the wall, like, oh, look at this imaginary space. You're in the art. You can see it. It's like an unlimited amount of paintings, because you can be in it, you can meditate in it, you can fall asleep in it, etc., etc. And yeah, just kind of went in there, and also just this idea of like creating these kind of spiritual spaces, I guess, and just going into these, I don't know, it's these trying to create a new type of space and exploring like what is spirituality in VR, what's that intersection, or a lot of it is right. You're making a hangout space. So what makes a good hangout space in VR? Like it's not like designing a bench people are going to sit on it. But there's still some things, or actually I was having a conversation. He's like, you design a bench and people will gather around it, or no, a bar, because they're used to that bar and they'll just go around it and talk there. So it's kind of trying to... That's right. So it's trying to discover there's part of that heritage from reality. Fireplace is used in Allspace VR, for example, as like a primal meeting space. But so we have that language of that heritage of reality, and then we've got a whole bunch of stuff we don't even know that we don't know yet. Just like, the internet now seems, oh yeah, of course, Facebook, ha ha ha. But like 10 years ago, we would have never known that that's the new language of the internet. Or if we would have seen it, we would have been like, whoa, this is almost overwhelming.
And I think apps are a good analogy for that as well. If you think about how early apps were, like it was literally just the website for companies. And then little by little, companies started to figure out how they could really tailor an app to be something very specific to a company and its branding and the functionality that they want to give as part of a user experience. The other analogy I like to use, similar to you with the internet, is the language of cinema. And sorry, how like, if you think of the early days of cinema where it would just be like long single takes, you're filming theater or just a thing happening. And then little by little you see cuts and montage and wide angle and close-ups. And then audiences learned how to read that so that now we can have an action movie where there's, 40 cuts per second. And it can be exhausting, but we can read that language. And so I think, you and I are both looking forward to evolving the virtual architecture, cinematic language, if you will, so that we can start to pull away from all the expectations that just come from real architecture and then start to have virtual spaces that are wholly based on the opportunities with this new medium.
Absolutely. That's kind of roughly the ping pong journey of how I got there. It's my art trajectory of like, I went from painting to, actually when I moved to New York, I used to have a studio and a bedroom. And obviously when you're in New York, if you can have a bedroom, you're lucky enough. I think it was like $1,200 a month for a bedroom where I could luckily have like maybe, 1.5 meters of VR space. Thankfully, that was a big luxury, but I still had like 2 roommates, a tiny kitchen, etc. Whereas, so basically I dephysicalized my art practice when I moved to New York and went fully virtual, and I haven't gone back to, I still sketch, but I don't have a painting studio anymore. I have a couple painting things there, but they're unopened. So I've fully transferred into digital art only, and trying to discover that language basically.
Yeah, and do you feel like that feels like a natural transition, and that you're getting enough out of this entirely digital and virtual medium that you don't miss the physical art as much, or what do you think?
If I had like a giant studio that was well aired and there was a canvas there, like, yes, I would start painting for sure. But in terms of the trade-off, in terms of, the rent that you have to pay, and like, do I feel like I'm missing anything? If anything, it's just kind of like when you're diving into something that's rough around the edges, like VR at this stage, the amount of pixels, it's not the same thing as if you were becoming a VR artist 10 years from now, where the Virgin's accommodation problems for the eyes have been fixed, and there is, the lenses are properly acting. What's the name of the artist that was just complaining about his eyes hurting?
Yeah, Danny Bittman, yeah.
Danny Bittman, yes. So he's doing like 6-hour sessions every day. To be honest, like, I don't actually do that much VR nowadays. I've just moved, and obviously there's a whole pandemic, which is having an effect on every person's like mental health. But like, people are like, "Oh my god, you're such a VR nerd." It's like, I've probably done like 5 hours this month, so I'm not as productive as I'd like to be. I'm kind of falling behind. But
are you doing a lot of 2D digital art though? Are you in Photoshop with like a Wacom tablet or anything like that?
No, I've been thinking about getting an iPad. Like, to be honest too, like, I was working in BIM before, like until 6 months ago approximately. And so when I'm working in BIM, it's so natural to me that it's kind of like riding a bicycle. There's no thinking involved. It's like, this is my forte. There's nothing, I love innovating, but like, I know generally kind of all the answers when it comes to BIM. So when I have a BIM job, it was easier for me to come after work. It's like, first off, it was kind of frustrating in terms of most architects and technicians don't learn Revit in school. So it's just kind of like, oh my God, when is this going to fix itself? Like schools need to start teaching kids Revit. It's not a fad. It's not going away. So there's that kind of industry annoyance. And so when I would come back from work, I was just kind of like, okay, I need to switch off my brain and just start doing VR art. So it was a little bit like escapism, but also I had a lot of mental energy left. And just, also the frustration of it was kind of powering the art in a way. Just like reality is kind of annoying and silly. I just need to go into create my own reality. Whereas now I have a new job at like Vim AEC where I'm working for, we're doing desktop because of COVID, but really we're also going to be doing VR and AR, specifically Magic Leap for AEC. So it's taking more of my brain. It's great because it's more in tune with my life mission of like, innovating rather than like helping people survive at what they should know. So it's more in tune with like what I really want to do, but at the same time, I'm not as like frustrated, and also it's just kind of taking more of my mental energies during the day. And I mean, we're in COVID, right? So it's like I'm working here all day, blah, 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 and then at 5 p.m. I'm supposed to like, okay, now I'm in artist mode, like till like how much energy do you really have during the day, etc. Although like I'm sure it'll balance itself out. I also just moved here a month ago, so that affects my productivity. Exactly, like COVID, new job, extremely rewarding, but also because it's a startup, because it's innovation, you have to think a lot more than just like, I've been being a BIM nerd for like 10 years, so BIM is easy peasy. Now I'm a product owner. I've never been a product owner before. Like, I didn't even know what that was a year ago. So, but it's been 6 months, so it's been a great adjustment, and I'm quite comfortable in the role. But it's a completely new role. It's not like I can go to work and do it with my eyes closed. I have to be aware all the time. So yeah, I have to try. And I mean, if life is too easy, like, maybe you're not learning much. So I feel like I like doing things that, weren't possible and that I don't know, and just being in that kind of unknown. And it's more innovation.
Real quick, I'm going to ask you a question that's very contentious in the BIM community, and I think I know what you're going to say, which is why I'm going to ask it. Revit/BIM.
Yes.
Design tool or documentation tool?
Well, it's terrible for design. It's possible to do. I'm actually kind of an expert in designing in Revit.
Yeah.
That's because I'm stubborn, and I have a lot of patience. But like, I am also very active in the Autodesk forums, and I've given an Autodesk idea system where people can vote on ideas and it can become a feature. So, Revit massing is incredibly broken and has not gotten love. It's kind of like a lot of the tools in Revit, they'll go to 80% and then they'll stop. Like, Revit's an amazing tool, but for some reason, it can't do legends properly, which is like, one of the first things you teach new employees. Well, they should have learned this in school, but you're teaching them Revit for the first time when they get hired. And you're kind of like ashamed to explain to them how legends don't work. It's like, yeah, okay, you can put a door there, and if the door changes size, it's going to adjust. And then, if you want to put a dimension, however, you have to draw these 2D lines, and the lines won't snap to the door, and you can't tag the door. And then they're like, wait, what? It's kind of like genius and stupid merged together. It's like amazing, and then they completely drop the ball on everything else. So I feel like there's really a huge need for like dog fooding. Like, have you guys ever tried to do like just a house project in Revit? Because like, have you ever tried to do a legend? Because it doesn't work. And it's one of the, like, every project has a legend, and when you do it in Revit, it's like half super smart and half doesn't work. So like, try it and you will see that it does not work. Instead of like trying to make me use AI to design everything, like, fix your basics. Instead of like just always trying to have a new feature for the marketing department, like, fix your basics. Try to do a project in Revit and you'll see all the places where it's completely ridiculous, and then fix those things. So it's a love-hate relationship. And like same thing for massing, right? Like I've done crazy projects with massing, with adaptive components, with families inside families inside families. Well, like I've done a thing where each panel has like 30 families in there, and then I can extract all the materials, all the areas, everything like that. But and then there'll be like 15, I think there was 1,500 of those panels, and every panel had like 30 to 60 components in them. But like, for example, when I go into the massing, I can't select any of the panel in the schedule. They just disappear from the schedule. So if I want to select more than one panel, I have to go one by one. So it's like amazing, powerful tools with completely ineffective workflows that have never been tested, and then they've just abandoned it and they're never going to revisit it. So it's a love-hate thing. It's like I feel like BIM is like 80% perfect or 85, and then what's left is like extremely grating and annoying. But you can work around it. But yeah, it's not like it should be.
I could not agree more.
Yeah.
So when you sat down, so I want to try to understand the design process going into the Museum of Other Realities. Did you already have a space that you were showing, an alt space that kind of made its way into that project, or was this kind of a different design prompt?
So there was the initial AltSpace VR gallery, and then I did my other gallery, which is kind of like my super long-term gallery. That's more like the AltSpace galleries was kind of like two towers connected with a corridor, and then there's a courtyard. Pretty simple. And then I worked on like my gallery that's not even finished in the last 2-3 years. Like I haven't really worked on it actively. Well, it's that 12-room gallery, which right now I'm editing. Like I did a tour at the Moore, and I'm editing a video that's roughly an hour or two. That's quite a range, actually. I think it's an hour, maybe. But I'm editing it, and I'm going to put pictures of those things I'm talking about because it's only in my head right now, and nobody has any idea what I'm talking about when I say, "Oh, I made a really nice 12-room gallery." So that 12-room gallery I've showed to Colin and Robin, and they're like, "Oh my God, we really want to do this." Something like this for the future of Moore. I really love this room. I really love this thing you did with that. And so at the time when we were talking about it, I think there was like a different CEO, which is now Robin. And so he's like, okay, for copyrights, everything you do comes on our side, and we can't use anything that you've already done. And then it was all like, it was like, I couldn't show like a sketch of what I was going to do. So it was all overly complicated, and I was afraid that like my best work was just kind of going to be taken away from me in a way where I couldn't discuss it. And now they've just super simplified it. Now that it's just Robin and Colin again, they're just like, show whatever you want from the process. It doesn't matter. And so it's like, great. That really opens up it to be more of a conversation of me sharing my sketches, of me sharing my ideas. So, so they saw that 12-room gallery I'm talking about. And just regarding that 12-room gallery, what I'm doing is I'm putting a piece in it, and I'm taking one room at a time and releasing those rooms as art pieces that are for sale. And I'm represented by Elephant Gallery in Montreal, so I'll have shows in there. And also I'm a curator there now for the VR part of the gallery. Obviously, COVID kind of just canceled all of that, but I had a whole show every month with a different artist, Canadian and international. Obviously that's kind of canceled until we have some sort of safe way of doing VR, or maybe it'll go on to Museum of Other Reality format. So I was going to release every one of those rooms, maybe one every 6 months, and after whatever amount of years, once they're all released, do a giant master bake. And that sounds wrong, but a bake of all the models together. And because if I were to take it on, it would just fail. It would just be like, okay, you just bake the lighting for, and baking lighting, for those who don't know, is kind of similar to rendering. So, you make a bake of the lighting for 20 hours, and then you realize it doesn't work. And it's just too much to chew at the same time to have everything to a level that I like. So I'm like, every 6 months or so, I'll do one room, and eventually I'll release it all as one. So that 12-room gallery was kind of the main inspiration for Robin and Colin, but they wanted something different, and especially because of the whole copyright thing, because they were paying me as a consultant to do this. The CEO at the time was very adamant, like, do not bring in any of those rooms in, because then it mixes us for copyrights. And so I was like, okay, I'll just do completely new rooms and start a whole new process. So I do go into that generally, into that presentation. Like I did the tour, and so now I'm editing the tour. We had a lot of problems with the video, so it's taking a longer time than expected. And now I've decided, I really want to illustrate all of this presentation, so I'm going to take another month or two to keep editing the videos on the weekends and just put like images. Oh, I have a 12-room gallery. Okay, put an image, show what you're actually talking about, because otherwise it's just words.
Yeah, I just want to make sure I understood a little bit about how the design of the Museum of Other Realities evolved, and if early drafts, early sketches looked significantly different from how the space looks now. But it sounds like the space is constantly evolving and being updated. And maybe this is a follow-up question for later, but I'm also particularly curious what it looks like when an artist is getting their work into the space. And does that require a lot of direct interfacing with you, or is there like a Unity SDK they can download and kind of put their own work into it directly? I'm interested in that process as well.
Right. So, I mean, I was basically an architectural consultant for the Museum of Other Realities. And so, they definitely don't go through me when they put their art, but I can tell you from the perspective of an artist how it works with the Museum of Other Realities. Basically, you give them an FBX, and at the moment, they don't take baked lighting, at least for me, but they are very adaptive to different mediums. So I've seen walls with videos on them. I've seen a bunch of stuff that's not traditional. And when it comes to VR art, there's kind of two. If I can find a sketch here of So in terms of the art, generally they'll just say, okay, well, every piece is maximum, let's say 500,000 triangles. So decimate your piece, send it to us as an FBX, and that's it. That's all. So you'll use Simply Gone or Pro Optimizer or whatever to get it to that mesh level. And in terms of VR art, there's kind of two major flavors. There's art that is going to receive lighting, and there's art that is I don't know what the right term is, but basically tilt brush. You have to paint the light. It's not going to receive lighting. It's kind of like a cartoon. The red, exactly. It's self-emissive. It's not going to react to shadows. So if you put a bright piece in the dark, it's going to look extremely bright. So there's the advantage of full control over the lighting. I'm more towards the let's make a shape. The shape receives the lighting. But there are two different approaches. Yeah. So
and then also folks like Kevin Mack that are developing a lot of their own custom shaders. So I imagine that requires some work to get everything running smoothly.
Exactly. So those are there's two major flavors, and then there's like the advanced flavor, which is your programmer at that point, or Kabibo. He's probably transferring the whole Unity project that they're incorporating rather than just saying, hey, here's the FBX, etc. So yeah, at that point they're very much like developers, and I'm not a developer. I did a little bit of programming, but I'm never going to be a developer. I know that's not for me. So that's how you get the art in, and obviously that's through Colin and Robin, the founders. And the other thing you were asking me was about the process, I believe, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. So, I mean, here's some sketches. I'm not sure if you can see them.
I can,
so,
yeah. Excellent.
Like designing skin ideas, parametric skin specifically. Let me see. Or see here the kind of, what am I writing here? House in the distance. So kind of a tower that's split a little bit like a cross here, where you would just slice the building in half like butter.
Yeah.
I mean, these are not great ideas. They're just the ones I can find.
Well, I see the Louis Kahn influence for sure.
Yeah, or see here like kind of a sphere, and once again like a slit, and just to let the light in, right? Because to get that drama, you need a lot of darkness, and then the beam of light comes into the darkness. That's where the magic happens. So contrast, exactly. You can't have yes, you can have 1,000 lights, but you don't necessarily want to live in a diamond, and you won't get that drama, that precious, precious drama. So, yeah, it'll start with sketches like that, a lot of sketches, and then I just sit down at the computer and actually a lot of my design is done in Revit. I'd say the majority of my design is done in Revit. And
I can hear all the BIM traditionalists saying, boo, boo design in Revit. But another parallel between us is, if you know Revit well enough, it actually can work as a design tool. You can do good work there. And stairs, you mentioned how stairs, I agree completely. So easy to do stairs in Revit compared to most other programs.
Absolutely. It's probably the easiest thing to sell an architect on. And I'll go back to my education. I did 4 years in architectural technology where we weren't taught Revit, but I learned Revit. They were like, do a multiplayer, not a multiplayer, like a cooperative project. You can use whatever you want. So that's where I really learned Revit with my 2 other friends. And that's where I started doing rendering and everything. And so I come from that background. Then I did the lighting design for 2 years, and I ran the office in Revit. And then I went to university for 4 years. And in university, I was like, okay, well, I won't have time to learn Revit when I'm outside university. So I need to learn everything I can about designing in Revit because it's not that good, but it's possible. So that's where I really honed in on massing in Revit and all the weird stuff and how it doesn't work and how it does work. And it's not hard for me to do massing in Revit and parametric stuff. And I'm really good at it. Although, I wish it was so easy that it didn't take 4 years to not that it took 4 years to learn, but it took 4 years of pushing the envelope to just be able to turn around and say, I can do really weird stuff with the Revit massing, even though it's quite flawed. I know the flaws enough that I can work around them. And I still wish, if Autodesk, if you're listening, fix your massing. I'm going to smack your hand or something.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And then, so have you done things where you'll take something you've done in Medium or Tilt Brush or one of these VR design programs, and then bring it into Revit as something like an underlay or an overlay, and then create the geometry on top of it?
Yes. So the video I showed that's on my YouTube from 4 years ago, that was in university. So at that point there was no touch controller. So that's what I did. I export Revit, and basically what you want to do is you want to design in VR with the context from Revit. You don't want to imagine, I think this is the city block heights. You want to have that context, that existing. So, in a project you would say, I'm going to model the existing in Revit. Once it's ready, I have the urban context. It's not like a building floating in nothing. Like you see a lot of those Revit projects where the house, and you look around, you're like, there's no floors. This building is in space. So you need to build the context, the urban context, to know how tall is your neighbor. Am I getting some shadow from this building, etc. So you build your context in Revit, you build your landscape in Revit, then you export that to VR. And in VR, that's where the magic happens. For some reason, the industry hasn't gone that way, but you can say, what if we connect those 2 buildings? And I had the chance to work at Provence-Chez-Roy in Montreal, which is a very really good design firm, and they're lucky enough and they're big enough that they get those projects where you're not building a box. They'll have these dramatic, there's this thing in Quartier du Spectacle where it looks like the house, the building is just chopped in 2 and the opening is all red. And they'll have, so if you want to do those dramatic things, VR is perfect for that. You can just draw onto the environment and make those moves, or say, what if we build a bridge here and this thing comes out there and da-da-da-da-da-da. So you bring your stuff into Medium, your context, you do those propositions. Or actually, when I was in university, there was one teacher, he's like, I want you to take 5 sites, model the context, and then do 3 design options for each site. So VR was perfect for that. It's quite, there's a lot of room for improvement for that process because that process doesn't exist officially. But once you go over the technical limitations of it, it's amazing. Like, you feel exactly how every architect should feel, as in, like, I completely understand the setting, the repercussions, and I can basically translate what's in my brain very naturally, instead of saying, oh, I'm going to do a section here, and then I'm going to figure out this angle, and I think it's going to look good. And then in 3D, as for you model it, it doesn't look good. So yeah, and you have to work in kind of a skeleton, right? That's not the right word, but des arêtes, like, so yeah, you kind of have to work into a skeleton. And what I'll do is I'll draw the skeleton. What's the word I'm looking for? Like, it's like the side of a cube, for example, is vertices. You have to, like, work in vertices, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Like, yes, you could model all the surface and the skin, but if you work in vertices and making that skeleton, you can fill it out later. So what I'll do is I'll draw that skeleton, and then in Revit, I'll just make a mass out of that skeleton. Easy as that. Because, if in Revit, like in that example of that video, it's like all of these circles, these kind of tubes that are inside of each other, and they're at these weird angles. And when you model it, when you sculpt it, it's very natural, and you feel it because you're in the space. You're kind of like Godzilla/God mode, and you feel that it's right, and you feel that this is the art piece that you want to do. Whereas if you're in Revit, you have to, like, set up your reference plane at this angle, and then you're going to draw a circle at this angle. So you're never going to get that. And even in SketchUp, right, you're never going to get that, or Rhino, you're never going to get that intuitiveness of doing it right from your heart and your guts and your brain right into the space. And then in Revit, you're like, oh yeah, of course, here, I'm just tracing the skeleton. So, okay, I'm going to cut a section through it, put my reference, draw the circle, do that like 6-7 times, connect the things together. And you're basically tracing what came out very naturally from that VR session. Which would have taken so much longer if you were doing a hit and miss, modeling on the screen, etc. And you wouldn't have experienced the space to know that it's right or not.
You're making me think as well about the differences between having design meetings with other architects or those who are spatially literate and can look at a plan or a section and get a sense of what's going on there, versus with those who, what's this little thing that we know represents a door swing, and it makes no sense to them. VR has been such a magical tool for just getting everyone onto the same page, so
yes.
that way you can move on to, I love exactly the way you phrased it, talking about how things feel and more of the nuance of how design is operating. And I remember pre-VR, a lot of the architecture firms I was working at, we'd have a 2-hour meeting where it's just trying to convince a client or a client or a collaborator of what a space feels like. And we might have renderings and all sorts of things. And no one really trusts renderings, because renderings are always more about evoking something rather than being realistic. And so as soon as we could just say, hey, this is what it'll be like to be in the space, and they put on a VR headset and they can look around, then yeah, it's amazing how much more exciting the design conversations can become. So it's fun how that applies both to real architecture, but then also virtual architecture, because still you can talk about how virtual architecture feels, and your body doesn't really care so much whether it's in real architecture or virtual architecture. It's still responding to a lot of those primitive ideas of compression and release and light and shadow and color. So there's a lot of wonderful opportunities to take the training that we already have and then take the new opportunities that come from not worrying about budget and allowing things like gravity to shift and really playing with this new form.
Absolutely. And I'm actually quite anti-rendering and pro VR, obviously. Like, I feel like rendering, especially like at the school it was all about rendering at Carleton University. There's a big history of hand drawing and rendering, and I really feel like it's a culture of creating lies. And especially as a lighting designer, you'll have the classic, like, oh, we put a square lighting up the ceiling, so you look at the building and it's all lit up and there's no lights anywhere, and there's just always this dramatic light, but you're like, where does that come from? It's coming from a tree. Like, there's the invisible light floating above the ceiling. And so it's really become a culture of lies and convincing the client to kind of shut them up and getting to spit out the money. And really, it's not what you're building. You're selling a lie, and you're building something else. And oftentimes, it becomes a play of images, and the buildings they're actually building with that money that they're winning are terrible. And the plans are tiny. It's like a little prison condo, and the people living in there are going to be miserable. And the rendering looks great, though.
Well, it's fun to hear, to think about you also being a fine artist who also does things like sculpt. I think there's a lot of architects that really secretly just want to be sculptors, and it's unfortunate that some of them actually are building real buildings because they're creating something that maybe in an urban context like looks really fascinating at that zoomed out scale, but then once you're inside the building and that's where you're going to work every day, it's atrocious and horrible. So you get this wonderful opportunity as a virtual architect to take some of your sculptural instincts, and you can very easily decide in the middle of creating something whether that really just wants to be a sculpture or if it actually works really well as an occupiable space and you're not ruining anyone's life in the process.
And the environment, right? Like all of these bad decisions impact the environment without having any positive impact other than on the ego of the architect. I'll tell you a kind of a horror story of how bad the architecture culture can be from a Carleton graduate, actually. So I was working with this architect at this firm, and this designer doesn't use anything except SketchUp. He will not open Revit. He doesn't want to know anything about Revit, and he will give the SketchUp models and keep updating it, and the technicians or the younger architects will have to do something in Revit with it. So there's always these two buildings living next to each other, and obviously the SketchUp one has nothing to do with reality, and then everybody has to kind of follow what the architect is doing, and there's this idea of like old educated people control everything that's happening, and they have really no idea what's going on, and it's super inefficient, and the client's losing money. But basically what it was is he designed the skin and the outside of this building in SketchUp, and it was beautiful. And then they have to cram apartments in there, and it's a complete prison. It's terrible. Nobody's going to be happy with it. It's kind of like, here's a piece of art, and then they just do this thing, and no attention comes to the inside, and it's just like, oh my God, they're going to build this. And like I said, the only person winning is the ego of the architect. He's the only, and so we're destroying nature. We're destroying these people's lives. And who's winning? Oh, it's going to make a great render of the outside. So there's a sickness in the architecture world in terms of that at the moment that I don't want to say that kind of I don't want to target Zaha Hadid, but like, the just like the boomf, the trying to get on the front page without actually doing real good architecture. Or I mean, she did have kind of a disaster. I didn't actually find an article about this, but I did hear about it, so I may be wrong. But I think that the Olympic pool in China or something, there was like 200 seats. It was one of those. I'll just sketch it out. It was one of the buildings where this is the shape in section, and so there were some places where the ceiling was so low that you couldn't see the pool from the seat. And so, this is a great example of terrible theater design. And if they would have, it's like if they would have tested it in VR, they would have known right away. So it's like, these are great ideas and paintings and renderings and pictures, but it fundamentally doesn't work as architecture. But yeah, you're right. A lot of architects want to be artists, and sometimes it's actually quite detrimental to everybody except the architect, and even possibly the architect themselves. There's something extremely wrong in the industry right now, where people don't want to learn BIM; they just want to do their little drawings and get famous and be appreciated by everybody.
Yeah, I'll tell a quick story, just piggybacking off everything you're saying, where when I first started to evangelize the power of VR to the larger architecture community, starting around 2013 with the DK1, and then from there, I was very surprised at first to find that there were some architects, I won't name names, that I'd show what this could do, and they'd get really upset by it, and they would feel like it was taking something away from the mystique that they could cultivate as the designer who knew everything and only chose to show you certain aspects of how the whole thing would look. But they like this idea that like no one's going to get to really experience the project until it's done and it's too late, or you're going to pay a ton of money for change orders. And so it reminds me a little bit of like the times when the Bible was just in Latin and, you needed to have like a priest explain the Bible to you. And it's like, no, we can't let everyone read it on their own and make their own interpretations of it. So I think there's architects that still kind of cling to that, where they want to be the gatekeepers of the design and not let anyone get too democratized into that process.
There's a lot of them, yeah. And you'll hear of architects like, oh, I don't want to show the client this part of the building. Sometimes it's because it's not ready, but sometimes it's like you said, they just want to, it'll open up design conversations. Like, aren't they paying you to make a building? They're gonna like this is not about you. It's about the client being happy at the end of the day. And I understand that there's some things that are wrong also with the contract culture and just lowest bid, right? Because if you design for a month and let's say you show the client something and he tells you to do 40 changes. Well, in the most contracts, you're not going to get paid more for those design changes. You had your bid and that's it. You get the work done, make the client feel like he's a little bit involved, try to, not expand your project by 3 months, not bring up those important questions that'll make the building a better place. So there is another sickness in terms of the contract culture, lowest bidder. Obviously, lots of bad stuff happens from low bid contracts in both the architecture and the contractor side of things. There's a lot of like core issues with it, but and also one thing that drove me completely nuts at Carleton was this kind of fascination with like the mystique of hand drawing and just these kind of things that were self-serving and doesn't, theoretical things that go nowhere that don't really have any value except for the poetry of it. But now I think, the whole COVID thing is going to probably have some major shifts in those aspects. Like you can't BS your way through utilitarian needs. You can't just, in green architecture, they'll have this thing where they draw the cold air and the hot air and they're like, oh, it's a green building now. And that's it. Oh, stack effect. It's going to work. And it doesn't work. The housing, there's a housing, I think it's like CMHC or something in Canada, how they do a bunch of research and they research a lot of these green buildings and they're like, okay, 80% of them, the claims they were doing are not true. And you look at them and they're just drawing the hot air, cold air. Oh, everything's going to work out. Look, I drew a sun with some rays over here. You'll be super comfortable in the winter and super comfortable in the summer. It's all going to be just fine. So it's like, there's a lot of that wishful thinking, and there needs to be just kind of a bit more of a still artistic but scientific approach. It's like for rendering lighting, right? It's like you need to render it and in a realistic way, and that it still be magical without you faking it in Photoshop. Because if you can make the renders and it's still magical, that means that when you're going to build it, it's still going to be magical. Whereas if you make it in Photoshop, they're going to give you the money and then they're going to build something and nobody's going to care. Like you can make the worst designs look amazing with hand drawing. Like I've seen this time and time again. Like it'll be like this ethereal thing and then they build it and it's just a bunch of like confettis and like they'll put a mop on a stick or something. Like you can make that look amazing with a hand drawing, but it's going to look nothing like it when you build it.
Ultimately, we should be focusing on what it will actually be like for the people who spend their lives here. And VR has a wonderful opportunity for testing people using a space, again, real or virtual. I got to work on a couple of hospital projects where we could actually have like a doctor who is going to be in that hospital come in and see what the OR is going to be like and, move stuff around. And that's an incredible opportunity that like every architect should be taking advantage of. But the idea that like it's beneath them to let the users of their space actually preview it and give feedback is such a bizarre notion that I hope is going to seem antiquated sooner rather than later. Thanks to all these incredible new tools at our disposal.
Yes, absolutely. So hopefully, and I mean, even the built world, like a lot of the built world, especially like COVID is once again proving this, like, you can have a great university without the environmental impact of building and running a university. A lot of the things we're building, sometimes I look at it and I'm like, is this an ego thing? Like, why are we actually building this? It's like some rich person that wanted to show off. It's a country trying to show off. And everything we build has a huge environmental impact behind it. So I think, if we can divert some of those ego projects that they become virtual or augmented reality, like, yes, there's still a cost to these headsets, the technology for the headsets, but like, look at the Museum of Other Reality, right? Like, if we would have built that in real life, well, first off, it would have been impossible, but the environmental cost would have been devastating. All that concrete, the steel, and then, 10 years after, or even a month after, it's old. We want change. We want something new. Whereas if we have to rebuild the Museum of Other Realities, well, the only costs are, hosting and the effort that the designer is going to put in it. So it's really kind of, if you have these megalomaniac projects, like, try to think about doing them in VR. And really, the architecture I do virtually is completely megalomaniac. Like, if I were to do that in real life, like, I would, it'd be great for me at the cost of everybody else and even myself. I'd really feel bad in a way because, it's great. It's not required. It's not like a hospital. It's just for pleasure and for pride and for. It's great. It's great to have, like, these moments of inspiration and spirituality and things like that. But you have to think about the cost. Like, if we can't live another 200 years, it wasn't worth it to have all of these churches and cinemas and museums. It's like, if the museums are destroying the earth, like, just have worth museums and the human population could live 1,000 years, or like, don't have universities, just do education online. And there's so many aspects there where dephysicalization can completely revolutionize. Like, we can record the best university teachers and disperse that internationally, like, I mean, beyond international, beyond our borders, and then still have remote teachers' aides that review your work personally. But like, I could have had a class by like Frank Lloyd Wright, right? Instead, I got some guy or some person. I mean, I got some great education, but some of it wasn't so great, and I had no say in that. At the end of the day, it's like some person that never actually did architecture. Sometimes, it's like, well, I could have had a course by Zaha Hadid and like all of the best, but instead I had to get what was local and what was available rather than the best of the best. So there's a lot of room for radical thinking, and I think COVID is kind of proving some of that to be possible. Like, you know what? You don't need to travel 10 times a year to go to a conference. So there's all of these things, or there's all of these things that we're just doing for our pleasure, and really it's having a huge environmental impact. And we, it seemed like it was completely impossible to say to somebody last year, like, that traveling has a negative impact, that, and
or that they didn't need to travel.
Or that they didn't need to travel.
The only way I can do X, Y, Z.
That's right. Or like, I've been talking to galleries being like, hey, you could have a virtual version of your gallery and meet clients and show them your art and sell your art virtually. So that was like, ha ha ha, you're funny. That's never going to happen. And now it's like, oh my God, how do I do this? I need to do this right now. So yeah, I feel like virtual reality opens that door for those kind of activities to be mitigated. And there is a huge aspect of it that is environmental, or, I say environmental, but really it's like the survival of the humankind in terms of the direction we're going right now. And yeah, like even artists, right? Like we have a huge negative environmental impact. We create things that literally are not useful. And I say this as an artist that has painted a lot. Like I know a lot of people that do murals. Like it's extremely toxic. Paint is extremely toxic. Like there's an artist that I really respect. I'll show you some art. Stefan Thompson. Actually, I'll show you some older art and some newer art. So Stefan Thompson he used to be a graffiti artist in Ottawa, and this is from 2002. So he used to use a lot of color. He would do stickers. He would do these huge murals of these kind of psychedelic dinosaurs and crazy, amazing with colors. At some point, he studied, I believe, biology, like animals and chemistry and nature. And at some point, something switched, and Stefan Thompson became extremely eco-aware. And like this is his art now. He's basically doesn't really use colors anymore. All of his pigments he makes himself, and they have to be non-toxic. So you have some browns, bluish, greenish, very little, reddish sometimes, but very limited color palette. A lot of burning, a lot of carving, and he just went like fully ethical. Like he built his own huts on people's properties in like the middle of nowhere. He lives without electricity. Like once in a while he'll connect on somebody's Facebook or Instagram to publish his work. He makes his own clothing out of like animals he'll find on the side of the road, like roadkills literally. But like, you know, he'll like scrape the fat and like make mittens and boots. I think his Instagram is like Stefan Thompson Tracks. Like he's like the most ethical artist I've ever known, and like so talented too. It's crazy. Like I always felt, and he's super isolated. Like I always felt like, okay, if the world ends, like Stefan Thompson is gonna be fine. Like he's building his own house. Like doesn't have electricity, creates everything like naturally, and he'll just like ask for a ride because he doesn't have a car, so he'll ride out of the country through like other people's like that. So like, you know, if all artists were like that, it wouldn't be a problem, but that's not the case. And I mean, we're even just looking at artists that create good stuff, right? Like the amount of waste of like bad art is probably even worse. Or I've seen, you know, some artists, they'll just be like, I really love dripping paint. It's just kind of like a giant toothpaste disaster. And I'm looking at it and I'm like, the environmental impact. It's a little bit obsessive, but like, yeah, we're kind of one of the worst offenders. And it's funny because artists are like such kind of hippies. We're like, oh, you know, BP is ruining the world. Meanwhile, we're doing these completely useless things for our own ego and happiness. That's really not required. That there's alternative ways of doing it, and it's hard to disassociate ourselves from our own actions sometimes.
That resonates with me so much. I mean, I went into architecture originally out of the whole green buzzword, sustainable architecture direction. I was like, I can save the world. You know, buildings are responsible for 70% of the world's waste, and I can affect that. And then as architecture school went on, I learned more and more, not even through class so much, but through my own research, how much BS went into LEED certification here in the States, and how easy it is for buildings to really just use green architecture as a branding element, but not actually follow through with any of that. And then you're still having a huge environmental impact. Then I had my theater group that I co-founded in college, and we were so upset about like our environmental impact as like a little theater group, where we even got to the point where we rented a storage locker where it's like, we can't throw away our sets or our props. Like we have to store everything and try to reuse them. And then by the time I was graduating after 5 years of architecture school, we just had this giant storage locker essentially full of trash. Like it's so hard to reuse a lot of that stuff. And it just was like, oh. And so one of my initial elements of excitement with using, you know, real-time and emerging technologies was actually just thinking about the environmental impact, because, you know, we'd have all this, we'd have a lot of expensive and large formats to do our architecture work on. And I mean, one was an environmental aspect I was worried about, but the other was the expense. Like a lot of the stuff is expensive, and I'd be so afraid to like put pen to paper or paint to paper or ink to Mylar, because I'm like, oh, it's so expensive. What if I make a mistake? And so these digital technologies give us such an opportunity to just play and be creative, and it feels like you can't make mistakes as much, or you can make mistakes, but you can fail fast and just explore. And I find that to be such a wonderful aspect of these new tools.
Mm-hmm. I'd say like, the you're right. The lead thing is just a sticker that you pay for, and it doesn't really it's like, oh, it's maybe 5 or 10% less bad. But like you'll get like they're completely arbitrary points for being innovative.
You get points for just having a bike rack, even if there's like no way to get a bike there. It's like 2 points for a bike rack.
That's it. It's just a pat on the back for people. Like the real green architecture is don't build. Don't build anything new. Just renovate what is existing.
Or just minimize the footprint, as much as humanly possible.
Like probably 80% of the time, you don't need to build this. If it's not a hospital, if it's not infrastructure, you don't need to build this. Like you don't need another condo. Like there's enough. Stop growing the city. You don't need another conference center. So that's the real green architecture: is don't build it. Actually, the real green architecture is probably demolish it.
And then try to recycle all of the destruction as much as possible.
Yeah. Like there's no, except what Stefan Thompson builds, there's no green architecture. I've also meddled a lot in kind of 3D capturing people, and I think you're talking about sets, and I think there's a very interesting language that I haven't had the opportunity to get into, but in terms of digitizing theater, digitizing performance, movies, like that whole Unreal architecture coming into theater, being part of the story, being emotional trigger. There is so much possibility there, and I really want to see, theater people starting to explore that. And I know that they're not the most technical people, but it's easy to get a Connect and to scan people and to scan real worlds. You get a little nerd that does 3D modeling and ask him to model stuff for you. 3D scan people, put them in those spaces, and it's not that hard to make a Unity VR game where you're in a completely surreal world. You're playing with scale, you're playing with reality, you're playing with a bunch of things you couldn't play with in theater. Like, I really want to see that world, theater embrace VR. And it's crazy because it's been possible for a few years, but I've seen almost no movement in that direction. So that was my thought on that.
Yeah, my partners and I have been exploring that quite a bit. Originally with High Fidelity VR, we had like a group called Alive in Plastic Land that started with improv comedy, and that led into a scripted piece at the Venice Film Festival last year. And a lot of it has been pushing, like, how do you keep this accessible to as many companies as possible. Theater, of course, isn't like the tech world where there's tons of money being thrown at this stuff. And so that also, and recent conferences I've been involved with, TCG, the Theater Communications Group being a big one here in the States, always trying to evangelize ways that performers and theater artists can get involved with these tools. So in case this gets posted, shameless plug for another thing that'll be coming out soon. Myself, Brendan Bradley, who partnered with Michelle Cortez of Facebook as part of an NYU course. Brendan Bradley created a lab at NYU that's all about teaching using these tools. And then Jasper Tarr, who has done a ton of amazing theater experiments using digital technologies. He's currently the lead host for Adventure Labs, like escape room thing. I think the current episode is called Dr. Crumb's School for Disobedient Pets, which I got to do last week, and it was absolutely fun. So we're coming out with like a little webinar that was supposed to be part of the main TCG conference. TCG did like a hard pivot into like really supporting and amplifying, people of color voices, underrepresented voices, which was excellent. But we're sitting on this webinar that we're going to release soon, and I think that'll be useful both to people who are already in the digital VR worlds and are curious how they could start to be more involved with live events, and then those who are already in live events but don't know as much about the technical side, because we're really trying to make this as simple and cheap and approachable as possible. And like you just said, a lot of the technology is already here.
Nice.
I have two questions for you to wrap up. You've been very generous with your time, and I only want to keep you for 2.5 more hours if we can keep it that way. The first is, you mentioned a couple times spiritual experiences and spiritual architecture, and that's something that's fascinated me as well inside virtual reality. So I'm just curious if you can speak for a moment about any particularly powerful spiritual experiences you've had inside virtual reality or augmented reality.
I don't have the references right now, but obviously architecture can evoke emotions in people. How is a more complicated topic. So there was one text from 300 or 400 years ago, and I really should remember this guy's name by heart, but and he was one of the romantics, or at least a theoretician of the romantic art period. And his theory, this is just one of many theories, but it's one that's always kind of stuck with me. As at first you're just like, what the heck are you talking about? His theory was, and he had many aspects of it, but basically something about kind of like terrifying people would make them feel infinity or like the holy, and you may know who this is, and then a lot of it had to do with church design, right? So you come into the church, and you talked about it earlier, the compression and decompression of space. So you come, you're a little peasant, whatever, you've been harvesting potatoes all your life, and the farm and the hogs, and you come into this very ornate, very concentrated door, which some people have likened to the birth canal, and then all of a sudden it's like the sky is exploding, there's symbols everywhere, there's 1,000 symbols to read, you're completely overwhelmed. And that's kind of what he was talking about. And you look at this and you're like, how is it possible that human labor could have built this? This is the romantics had an obsession with nature, and nowadays it's like everything's controlled. There's barely any nature except tornadoes and COVID and things, the few things that we can't control. So it's kind of like that time where you lose control as a human, where you're on the border of falling to eternity, and it's almost like what is it called when you're like afraid of falling? Vertige, like vertigo. So a church is almost like an inverse vertigo, where you have like the infinite above you, and you're on the border of like the mountain where it's all falling down or something. So that's, and I'm explaining it terribly, but those aspects muddled through my brain of like the grandioseness, and how can you kind of like make people experience something that's akin to the holy, or just that'll make you go through these very extreme emotions. And a lot of it too in architecture is theory, right? You'll be very excited, you'll draw, you'll make a render, you'll make a model, and you don't know if it's going to work or not. So that's what I love about the more, is watching people react to it. I haven't really done it, but I'd love to be just the ghost, the shadow following somebody. And like, actually, there's been meetups, and oftentimes people have no idea I designed the space, and just seeing their reaction to the space is so rewarding. And there's a lot to be learned from it, right? Like just studying how people react to your spaces, especially in VR, because in VR, it doesn't work, I'm going to change it. It doesn't cost anything. That's it. In architecture, you work on it for 10 years, it gets given to the contractor, you sign off at the end, you never see that project again, except, you're going to do your marketing tour where you pay the photographer. But you're not going to stand there for a week, a month. You're not going to go work in that office. You're not going to live in that building most of the time. And so there's not as much as that possibility of iterative architecture of like, you know what, version 1 was great, but version 100 was much better, and we learned so much. And I was talking, I was doing this talking with, I don't remember, it's like VR and Philosophy. I don't remember the guy's name. But one idea that I really like that I realized yesterday, the Japanese were already onto this, which is kind of architecture that adapts to your needs. I mean, Japanese were like, oh, we'll just add like a pod. Boop, 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 boop. So it's not the same thing, right? Yeah, it's like, imagine if I start going like, ah, and then the walls like expand and become blue, and like just, it's almost like a mood ring as a space, like, but beyond what a mood ring is, obviously, because now we have like AI, and it's probably been like creeping out on me for like 15 years on Facebook, so it knows how like the bubbles should look like in the space. And, my friends come in and then the space changes again. So obviously they'll be more realistic with something like VR or AR, I mean. But that idea of not beyond iterative spaces, where it's like a space that you've made a bunch of updates to, like software, just like space that reacts to you, like Siri, or just, that is... You're almost like in the belly of the beast. You're in a living thing. Your space is alive, and it's reacting to you. It's reacting to the weather. It's reacting to the city. Like maybe this, COVID, everybody's sad. Okay, the building is sad. Like it's reacting to the micro and the macro and the international news and whatever. It's just kind of like you're inside this benevolent dog or something, and you see... It's not trying to digest you. It's actually like protecting and housing you or something.
Yes, absolutely. And then my last question is really just, it's the year 2030 now. What kind of projects is Sam working on? What kind of stuff do you see in the future that both technology will enable, and then just kind of the direction that you're hoping to go with your own work?
I am full of projects right now. And all of these are after work. So I'm designing new conference rooms / presentation rooms for the more. Although I've kind of slowed down with the move, and the COVID things kind of brought me down a little. So I need to get back on that. There's a festival called Mural in Montreal, which is a mural festival. They do graffiti, actually. So I have some connections to that world from my past. And obviously there's things like Kingspray. So we want to use Kingspray to kind of digitize the festival. I mean, one of the things I find very rewarding is giving access to VR art to traditional artists that don't have access to it. So one of the things I'd love to do, either through programs or whatever, is to, actually I have an example right here, is to give them access to VR. So like this, for example, is a very powerful and compact PC. So it has a 2080 graphic card in it, which can basically handle any kind of VR. So what I'd love to do is kind of have a program where I have 3, 4, 5 of these, and I ship it for a couple months to artists, whether it's graffiti artists, whether it's painters, whether it's students, and just say like, yo, you're really good and you're interested in VR, so have access to it, because you can't just say, hey, that looked really cool and I would do all my dreams. All I need now is $3,500. So if you can give them a little taste of it, let them create, open up their minds. I've found that whenever I get traditional artists in VR, it's very transformative for them, just like it's been for me. And it's a magical kind of process. And so I really love seeing that. And I feel like, Montreal can become kind of a leader in terms of VR art, and something like that can help, that can spark the fire that'll just happen faster. I've kind of put my own art on hold during the whole COVID stuff, because I can't really show it. And there's another major thing too. Oh yeah, well, I mentioned I've been curating VR art. So Armeur, which is a gallery in Montreal, huge gallery, like 3 floors. We're going to have a giant VR AR art show for, I think it's their 25th or 30th anniversary. So we're going to have a huge art show in March 2021, and probably a symposium about VR and AR art, specifically aimed at the industry. So what does it mean to collect art? What does it mean to buy art? What does it mean to show art? All of those things, if you're a gallery and you're like, I don't know what the heck this means. Like, what does it mean to have VR art? And if you're a buyer, so I was talking earlier about it's super hard, or at least, well, it's getting easier and easier, but it's super hard as a VR artist to go to the gallery and be like, yo, I have some VR art for sale. Do you want to sell it? And, oh yeah, of course. That doesn't really happen. Or there's, maybe 1 or 2 galleries in every city. And so trying to spark, once again, that change, that kind of revolution in the art world, through a symposium and a giant VR art show. So it's 15 artists, and we're in the process. Like, we just sent them letters. Some of them didn't respond, so we may have to pick other people. So I'm organizing that show, curating it, and also organizing the symposium. And because of the COVID thing, it may be that it only happens in the Museum of Other Realities. So we're working with them as well as MOVA and some other groups. So yeah, that's a big thing. And I feel like I'm forgetting stuff. I mean, my really good friend Sebastian Miller is going to be graduating from his VR program in October. So we've always been working together. Like 2 years ago, we had AR art show at his house, which we transformed into a gallery, and then we had AR fashion show, and this was like very early on. So I'm sure in October, when he's out of school, like, I don't know what he's basically just been a full-time artist all his life. So I'm thinking maybe he's going to want to do VR art galleries for people, and I can help him in that. And maybe he can maybe start a little business, and I can help him out. Or there's going to be some really cool VR art project with Sebastian Miller, and when he's out of school, like, he's learning so incredibly fast, and he has this whole like, he's been building a magical world in his head for over 10 years now, and all of a sudden he's realized he can do VR very well. So it's like that combination. I can't wait to see the project he's going to do, and just generally what's going to happen with him. So there's that, and like I mentioned, I'm the product owner at Vim AEC, so we're doing VR, AR for architecture, and that's obviously very exciting. A great startup, super powerful team. So there's a lot of stuff happening. New apartment, bigger space. It's going. I'm definitely busy, and I guess in the short term, well, within a month or two, I'll be releasing that video, and that video is going to be a good intro into my work, and hopefully at some point I make a website or something.
And people will be able to find that on your Twitter if they follow you there.
Yeah, on my YouTube, I'll put it on Twitter for sure, and I mean, probably the best way is just like look up Samuel Arsenault-Brassard on YouTube. It's a pretty long, unique name.
You need a stage name, yeah.
I just go by Sam AB. But it's great. Like, if you Google my name, there's zero competition. It's just you have to type it. It's a problem.
Sam, this has been a really fun talk. Just to leave everyone who might listen to this with one final thought, just projecting into the future. We both see how quickly this technology is evolving, how it is changing the world, how it can change the world. Is there anything in particular that you're really excited to see come to fruition over the next 5, 10, 20 years?
Yes, I mean, one thing is architecture schools got to adapt. There's a whole new architecture world out there, spatial world, VR, AR. Get your architecture students to design these spaces. Nothing against programmers and nothing against innovators, but like, this is your realm, architecture schools. So get it together, take over this space before it gets taken over by the completely new type of people, and they look at you not as a good resource. So I'm excited. Like really, I feel like the architectural world has not taken on VR and AR, which are inherently spatial. They have not taken on that challenge, except for a few, you and Andrea and 10 other people. They've not taken on these spatial challenges, and sometimes they've lifted their nose at them, saying that, oh, it's not real. It's I've got all these philosophical reasons why it's not good. So I'm excited for designers to take on these challenges. I should, I shouldn't even be part of this picture. There should be 1,000 other people that you look at, and I'm just a footnote. I'm not even that good. Imagine if there was a Zaha Hadid in VR and AR. I wouldn't be in the picture. So I need the schools to just really take on the challenge and get those students attacking those challenges. That's the real innovation. Until the schools understand and attack the challenges and take it on, it's not as exciting as it could be. So I'm excited for the people who are masters of this to take on the challenge, and that's when the real innovation will come. We're still at the first years of the bad websites. We don't know what the good websites are. So I'm excited for when those challenges are solved, and you buy a house and it's filled with AR stuff, and it just came with it, and you walk through the city and it's filled with things, and just the next generation of space. Or maybe we're all confined at home, but we're still tripping out communally in the VR city, and it's great. As much as the situation is terrible, we still have a way to connect and escape together.
Yeah. I'll leave us on a Steve Jobs quote. I have mixed feelings about Steve Jobs, but what you just said made me think of everything around you that you call life was made up by people that were no smarter than you. And you can change it. You can influence it. Once you learn that, you'll never be the same again. And so I feel the same way as you. Why are we the ones on the cutting edge of this when there should be much more qualified people doing it? And yet I think this is always how budding industries and innovation happens. So cheers to us. Cheers to anyone who's creative and has great ideas that wants to dive right into this stuff and figure it out, because it's a great time. It's really a great time to dive right in.
Absolutely. Awesome. All right. Well, have a great evening, Alex. It was great chatting with you. And if you want to have other of these chats, it's great to talk to somebody who has the same background and the same passion. I wish there were way more of us that could discuss this.
I could definitely introduce you to 5 others. There's not a ton, but there's probably a few I know that you haven't met yet. So happy to make those connections.
You've also been more social. I'm very introverted. So you've taken on talking for a while now. You've had a presence online. So you're right that if you're actually social, you'll meet some of them. But yeah, we should figure out a way to, I don't know, maybe have a Museum of Other Realities meetup, or something like...
Andrea and myself, and then a very talented virtual architect named Kim Bauman Larson, I should introduce you to. We've been going on some virtual world tours, VR chat in different worlds in there and other platforms, and our next scheduled one, which we've had to delay a couple times, was for us all to go into the Museum of Other Realities together. So it would also be fun to get you involved, not just in that particular tour, but also just to go on these fun little architectural critiques of what do we think of this virtual space? They're a lot of fun.
On that note, I'm kind of lazy and bad at programming, but if I can get my 12-room gallery online through, what is it called, Normal, if I could just, I don't know how hard it is, but I'm just trying to find a way to share these things in VR multiplayer. So if Normal actually works like people say it works, where you just press play and it works,
yeah,
that's pretty much it.
Yeah, it becomes a little harder if you want to have things happen I pressed a button and then this exploded, and it explodes for everyone else as well. But if it's I just need people to move around and talk to each other, it's super, super easy.
That's all I need, and not fall through the floors. So, I mean, at some point in a couple months, maybe I can get my experience on there, and we can do a little tour, because that would be a really nice, little bunch of Archie VR nerds in there. I'd love to get you guys' opinion. And if you're going on a tour and you need you've got an extra, spot in your car, I'll definitely join along.
That sounds excellent. Thank you so much, Sam. I hope we get to talk again soon.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, Alex. Have a great evening.
Cheers. Bye-bye.